Tom Cotton. Senator Cotton, welcome back to Kilmeade and Friends.
Hey, Brian, it's great to be back on with you.
Well, man, I know this is extremely busy. We're going to talk Iran, and, man, no one outside the government is more passionate about it than I am. But I got to get your opinion on Chief Justice Roberts' opinion that was a 6-3 decision to uphold the exchanges, the subsidies for those states that did not decide to set up exchanges. What does it mean?
Well, Brian, I disagree with the Supreme Court's decision. I'm still reviewing the opinions, but I've seen Justice Scalia's reasoning, and it's pretty simple. It's hard to say an exchange established by a state means an exchange established by the federal government as well. It's not just millions of unlawful subsidies and taxpayer money that the Obama IRS has been paying, but it's also millions in unlawful taxes that the Obama IRS has been imposing. That said, the Supreme Court has made its decision, and I'm still committed to fully repealing and replacing Obamacare with the kind of patient-focused, patient-centered reforms that will allow individual Americans to make choices with their doctors, not with government bureaucrats and the IRS in charge.
Did you guys have a plan? Should the decision have gone the other way?
Yeah, Brian, we've been working for months to develop a plan that would have addressed the problem of millions of Americans, through no fault of their own, potentially losing their insurance without extending Obamacare, without trying to fix Obamacare, because Obamacare can't be fixed. Thousands of Arkansans, millions of Americans are paying higher premiums and higher copays. They're having less access to doctors, and they're losing jobs or losing hours, and that's because Obamacare is fundamentally flawed. This law is not getting better, and it's not getting more popular. It will be a centerpiece in the presidential campaign next year, and I fully expect that we will repeal and replace Obamacare when we have a new Republican president.
What do you think the president's going to say when he goes to the Rose Garden shortly to comment on the decision?
Well, the president's words about Obamacare really have not made much difference over the last 5 years. In fact, they've been proven false time and time again, such as when he promised that if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. Rhetoric is overmatched here by the reality of thousands of Arkansans and millions of Americans being hurt by this law, and the promises on which Obamacare was sold, that it would reduce the cost of health care, that it would cut the federal deficit, that would improve the quality of health care, once time and time again been proven to be false by reality.
All right, let's move on. Senator Tom Cotton, you were one of the first to speak out publicly and brashly and say how worried you were that we're going to be cutting a bad deal with Iran, or even talking with Iran with the P5+1. What do you hear? Are we close to it? Do you expect to hear a deal's done July 1st?
I certainly hope there's no deal reached with Iran, because every indication from the Obama administration at the end of the last round of talks and reports over the last week suggest that this deal is getting worse almost by the day. The terms that were announced in early April were not a deal. They were not a framework. They were just a dangerous list of concessions that would have allowed Iran to keep its stockpile of enriched uranium, that would allow them to keep their fortified underground bunker where they are engaging in enrichment activities, that wouldn't have even addressed their ballistic missile program. The few lines that the Obama administration had drawn at the time, such as Iran would get no sanctions relief and we would have no notice, anytime, anywhere inspections, apparently are also now on the table with Iran. So the best course of action is to walk away from the table, stop hunting for a legacy, stop this manic search for a deal, any deal whatsoever, and to get a better deal.
So you hear these stories and speculation. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, from his years as senator to trying to run for president, doesn't have really any successes to hang his hat on, that he'll do anything to get a deal with Iran. Does that worry you? Do you think that factors in?
I'm worried about not only Secretary Kerry, but also President Obama hunting for a legacy. There's always a logic of negotiation that kicks in when you have these kind of talks. The people who are engaged in them start focusing on the negotiations as a goal in themselves, not protecting America's national security as its goal. Ronald Reagan was not like that. Ronald Reagan proposed some of the farthest-reaching arms controls deals in modern history with Mikhail Gorbachev. But Gorbachev, in the end, wouldn't meet his own terms. So Ronald Reagan didn't strike a half-hearted compromise that would risk America's national security. He simply walked away from the table entirely. And then just a few years later, we won the Cold War without firing a shot. And of course, the Soviet Union is much stronger and more powerful than Iran is right now. We need to walk away from the table, press pause, and make sure that any deal is a good deal that protects America and our allies from a nuclear weapon. Not just today and tomorrow, but 10 years and 15 years from now.
is so important for people like you who understand the inner workings for us to understand the inner workings of Iran's nuclear program, when it started, where it was going, so we know how to curtail it or stop it. So those are called PMDs. So we want to understand the history of the program. Now, Secretary of State Kerry tells Judy Woodruff on PBS that, of course, Iran has to supply that or there's no deal. Then he says this last week, cut 22.
The possible military dimensions, frankly, gets distorted a little bit in some of the discussion in that we're not fixated on Iran specifically accounting for what they did at one point in time or another. We know what they did. We have no doubt. We have absolute knowledge with respect to the certain military activities they were engaged in. What we're concerned about is going forward.
So we don't have to really worry about it. What?
No, it's critical. I mean, that's one of the lines that is most important, that we know the past military work in Iran's nuclear program. So if we do have a deal and there are satisfactory inspections, that there's some baseline against which we can measure Iran's current work. And, Brian, this is just an example of how the President and Secretary of State Kerry have continued to grant concession after concession with Iran doing very little. That's why you're hard-pressed to find anyone outside of the Obama administration who still supports these negotiations. In fact, many former Obama administration officials have just published a letter saying that the president is on a very dangerous course. People like General David Petraeus, a decorated military general, as well as director of the CIA, General James Cartwright, who is vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dennis Ross, who was a senior negotiator, Gary Seymour, who is coordinator of arms control and weapons of mass destruction. All these men are not conservative Republican partisans, but former Obama administration officials who have just released a public letter about the very dangerous path these negotiations have taken.
Here's the quote from the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker. He says, "It's breathtaking to see how far from your original goals and statements the P5+1 have come during the negotiations with Iran." So let's give a scenario. This horrible deal is done. They shake hands. Everyone celebrates. It goes to Congress. Can you guys reject it?
Well, Bob Corker is right that the president has walked away from every major goal he started the negotiations with. Remember, when the president started these negotiations 2 years ago, the objective was to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, to ship all of their enriched uranium out of the country, to close their fortified bunkers, to have complete access to all sites throughout the country, including their military bases. We've now conceded on every one of those points and more. If the president were to present that sort of deal to the Congress, I cannot imagine that Democratic senators and congressmen who are accountable to their constituents, who do not want to see Iran get a nuclear weapon, who know that Iran is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of soldiers in Iraq, that it continues to terrorize the region and the world as the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism, would stand with President Obama on such a dangerous deal.
Just let's think about, since these negotiations really got some momentum behind them, think about what Iran has done in Yemen, really putting their sponsoring Houthi rebels take over the country, which was not in our best interest. They are now once again supplying Hamas at a dizzying rate. We know they are single-handedly propping up Assad, and now there were reports last week that they are flooding arms and money into the Taliban, who they used to be enemies with. Why? Because anywhere we have interests, they seem to be going the other direction. Why does that not matter?
Brian, it matters critically. It's in the DNA of the Islamic Revolution and the Ayatollahs to confront Iran everywhere. As I said, Iran was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of soldiers in Iraq. When I served in Iraq, we all knew the kind of roadside bombs that Iran would ship into the country. We also knew that that was the one kind of bomb that our vehicles, whether it was a Humvee or a armored personnel carrier or even a tank, couldn't withstand. And just imagine what Iran, setting aside the nuclear dimensions of this deal, imagine what Iran will do immediately if they get $100 to $150 billion in new sanctions relief. They're not going to spend that money on schools and roads and other civil projects. They're going to spend it on terrorism.
But, Senator, I hear the genie's already out of the bottle. Businesses from with the P5+1 countries and others are saying, listen, we're about to lose these sanctions. I don't want to be the last one in. They're already beginning to cut deals with Iran where the sanctions would have kept them at bay and made it illegal.
Well, that's why we should have never started down this path to begin with, Brian. But you're you're right. Now that we're here and the Obama administration is signaling that there will be a deal, many countries, especially countries like Russia and China, who are involved in the negotiations and certainly do not have American interests at heart, or countries with large industrial companies who have a history of dealing with Iran, are beginning to get ready to go back to the country. But remember this, America is a $18 trillion economy, and we are militarily dominant in the world. Although we cannot throw our weight around on every single issue, when it comes to the most critical issue for our national security, stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we have unmatched, unrivaled leverage over anyone in the world to ensure that Iran does not get sanctions relief if we walk away from these talks.
And lastly, Senator Cotton, have you gotten pushback from your own party when you were so brash in coming out and forward and aggressive in coming out against this deal months ago?
No, Brian. I mean, when we released that letter to the Ayatollahs, Mitch McConnell and every elected member of Republican leadership, Orrin Hatch, the senior Republican and the president pro tem, fourth in line to the presidency, John McCain, and every other member of the Armed Services Committee all signed it, because they all know that 70% of the American people think these talks are not going to produce a good deal. 70% of the American people are right.
Gotcha.
This is going to be a bad, dangerous deal that the American people know.
Senator, I really appreciate the quality time. Of course, the Supreme Court decision, Obamacare stands the same way it is. It ruled 6-3 in their favor. Got you to comment on that and the deal that's coming our way next week, perhaps. Senator Tom Cotton, thank you very much.
Thank you.